chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. It reads, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. Now when he had agreed with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And he went out about the third hour and saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right I will give you.' So they went. Again he went out about the sixth and the ninth hour, and did likewise. Hired us. He said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right you will receive.' So when evening had come, the owner of the vineyard said to his steward, 'Call the laborers and give them their wages, beginning with the last to the first.' And when those came who were hired about the 11th hour, they each received a denarius. But when the first came, they supposed that they would receive more, and they likewise received it in each a denarius. And when they had received it, they complained against the landowner, saying, 'These last men have worked only 1 hour, and you made them equal to us, who have borne the burden in the heat of the day.' But he answered one of them and said, 'Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what is yours and go your way. I wish to give to this last man the same as to you. Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with my own things? Or is your eye evil because I am good?' So the last will be first, and the first last. For many are called, but few chosen." Brother Kris.
Thank you, Brother Davin, for the reading of the Word this morning. I've always found that particular scripture to be of interest to me, especially in our culture, when we have a lot of people who cry out that things are not fair, or they perceive that things are not fair from time to time. And we have, and had there, it looked like maybe the forming of a labor union in that context, crying out, "That's not fair, that's not fair." Labor unions in this country were started, I think, they didn't have OSHA and different things to govern and to keep industrial businesses in check, and so they had to have some safety measures. There had to be a system of checks and balances. But since then, we are so very safety-oriented in a lot of places. And so now it's become more about payment and insurances and getting people, the workers, getting the things that they want from the companies they work for. And I think you can get a little greedy on any one of those things, whether you're the company owner or whether you're the workers that want something more than from the company. Greed gets into the heart and mind of things, and it kind of ruins the whole thing. But Jesus pictures this landowner really as God Himself. And so you've got a picture of salvation, and whether you're coming into Christ and you've been a servant of His all your life, or whether you're one of those 11th hour Christians that just kind of gets in there at the last minute before you die, you have the same reward as what the teaching is. But He uses a physical principle to show a spiritual principle. And I just want to springboard off of that to help us understand that we have a problem in our culture, and we've had it for many, many years. The problem is when greed gets in, you can package it up however you want to, and it winds up being something very evil. I want to talk to you today about Marxism, dangerous philosophies. I believe it is the job of New Testament Christians, of Christianity, to preach the truth of God's Word. God's Word calls us to mark those which cause division and offenses contrary to the doctrine that we have received. It doesn't matter whether it was Jewish false teaching in the first century church, or whether it was humanism in our current culture, or Marxism in our current culture. Whatever it is, the ideals that are going around have to be challenged by God's Word. If we're going to be an evangelistic people, we have to challenge this particular doctrine. What is it really? What is it all about? And that's what I hope to talk to you about just a little bit today. But just a few more scriptures along this line. Luke 3 and verse number 14. John the Baptist had some Roman soldiers come up to him one day, very convicted by what he was preaching. What shall we do to get our lives right with God is what they wanted to know. And he says, do not intimidate anyone or accuse falsely. Don't do that. And, notice, be content with your wages. Be content with your wages. Isn't that interesting? Proverbs 31:16. Here is the Proverbs 31 woman. We always talk about that Proverbs 31 woman. And her price is far above rubies. Well, here she is pictured as buying a field. She sees a field, she buys it. Well, what is that? It is the acquisition of private property. What is she going to do with it? She's going to plant a vineyard on it. What do you have to have in order to run a vineyard? You have to have hired help. You're going to have workers. And so people are going to sell their labor for some wages, just as you did over here in Matthew chapter 20. We've been working for money for a very long time. Basically, I'm trading my labor for money that I can buy the things that I need to with my life, or in my life. Acts chapter 5 and verse number 4. Here's another property owner. Here's Ananias and Sapphira in the context, and they had sold a piece of property, and they had given the money to the apostles, but they'd passed it off as if they'd given all the proceeds to the apostles, which wasn't true. And Peter is saying to him, he says, don't you understand that while it remained, talking about your property, you still had ownership of your property? It was your own. Was it not your own? Is a rhetorical question. And after it was sold, was it not in your own control? In other words, once you got the money in the bank, it's still yours. Why have you conceived this thing in your heart? You've not lied unto men but unto God. So he was a property owner, and he had money from the sale of his property that was his, and he could donate and give however much. He didn't even have to give that. He could have just held on to it. Wouldn't have mattered one way or other. That wasn't the point. The point was they lied about what they were really doing when they made the donation to the church. 2 Thessalonians 3 in verse number 10. Even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any would not work, let him not eat. Don't let him eat. Now, here's the work principle. Now, some people can't work. Some people are physically unable to work. Sometimes a Lazarus is going to be laid at our gate. What are we to do for those people? Well, we're to help them out. We're to have compassion upon them. The Bible teaches us that we need to remember the poor. But that's not the problem. There's always going to be the poor. You're always going to have with you, Jesus said. There's always going to be those that have and those that have not. But communism is also what Marxism is called. And some of you may have read the Communist Manifesto. In 1848, Karl Marx and Mr. Engels published the manifesto of the Communist Party. The opening words of it were this. He says, a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. It is now haunting, conquering large portions of the world and enslaving and terrorizing many people, aiming at world conquest, is what George Benson penned in 1973 about this. Communism is a philosophy that was brainchild of Karl Marx, and it's also called dialectical materialism. Isn't that interesting? Materialism is the word that it's also called by. And it's really all about the history of all societies over a class struggle. The haves and the have-nots. They had a word for it. Bourgeois is the social middle class, the capitalist, I guess you could call them that, and then the proletariats were the working class people, the laboring class, the workers, and so there was this war that's going on between the workers and the owners of businesses, the people who have and the people who have not. And so this manifesto was written. The communists disdain to conceal their views and their aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. We've got to make a problem so that we can get our way, so that we can advance our cause, because it's obvious that there are people who have and people who have not. That's what this is really all about. It's about materialism. It's about getting things. It's about getting a way in life. Instead of working for it, you're going to demand it be given to you. And so the idea is a clash of opposing movements which lead to communism. And so here it is, the haves and the have-nots. That's the main difference in Marxist ideology. Marxists believe that the differences in socioeconomic class divide people in much more significant ways than just religion, race, ethnicity, gender, and geography. there's the haves and the have-nots. It really boils down to what you have or what you don't have. You know, Karl Marx dreamed of a perfect society, but he knew that in order to get what he wanted, he was going to have to, it required the downfall of governments, it would require the downfall of economies and societies, and then people would have to become robots. They would have to become cooperative with the movement, that you'd have to be pressed into cooperation. Do you ever see that today, that if a group like Antifa doesn't get their way, they'll just burn buildings down and destroy things to try to get their way? It's a war on what they want in culture and in society today. And so that's really a Marxian ideology, is to kill, steal, and destroy, to really go in and take things by force and make change, cause people to fear what it is that you're doing and get cooperation by fear. And so he did that. Marxism preaches social justice, which is another way of saying the redistribution of wealth. You have wealth, and so we'll take it from you and we'll distribute that to other people as we see fit. The people don't own private businesses or private property. There's no private property in Marxism. Everything is owned by the government or by the people, which means the government. And all industries would be owned by the government. And so you've got to really watch out when your federal government wants to control industries, when they take over education, and when they take over your health care, and when they take over the food industry, and all that. They have regulation on everything, but they got their hand in that pot. That is exactly what Marxism wants. They want the ending of private property, the private businesses, the private sector. There is no private sector. You hear that all in the news, about the distribution of these vaccines. Is it better for the government to do that, or should we let the private sector handle that? That's the big debate. And so, the government thinks it can do it better. That's the point. They want to have ultimate control over everything in a Marxist society. So you get people whose politics are Marxist, then you're going to have that kind of thinking within politics. In his book, Cleon Skousen's book, The Naked Communist, he describes Karl Marx and the people that he creates. In other words, Karl Marx is a man who set out to create all other men in his own image. And so this image he hoped to construct with a great human colossus, with Karl Marx as the brain and the builder. He surveyed the world and dreamed of the day when the whole body of humanity could be forced into a gigantic social image which conformed completely to his dream of a perfect society. Really, in his book, he describes the Marxist man. He calls him, he really gives him a name, the Homo Marxian, the human being that's a Marxist, and describes them as people who are trained to think or conditioned to think like criminals. And producing, he says, such a race has been the dream of power-hungry men for more than 4,000 years. Homo Marxian man is frightening and puzzling to the rest of humanity because a criminally conditioned mind does not respond the normal way people expect. For example, he gives, if a well-meaning person invited a professional criminal into his home for dinner, the shifty-eyed guest would be likely to survey the fine variety of choice foods, the expensive silverware, and the shiny goblets, and completely miss the warm sincerity and friendship which the host was trying to convey. In fact, the criminal mind would probably conclude that his host was not only soft-hearted, but soft-headed, and eventually he would get around to deciding that such a weak man could not possibly deserve so many fine things. Then he would spend the rest of that evening figuring out how he could return in the darkness of the night and relieve his host of all of his bounteous treasures. Isn't that interesting? Marxists live by jungle law. Anything goes. There's no right, there's no wrong. They have to deny God, they have to deny morality because anything goes. Whatever can be done in the name of expediency to further the cause of the grand utopian dream, which is really interesting because you've got this wonderful utopian society, but it can only be achieved by criminality. This Marxist man is very insecure, and as a result, he's a control freak. And any organization that is Marxist in its ideology is very open with what they preach and what they believe. They're not trying to hide it, they're trying to show you. They're trying to educate you and teach you. Most of you are familiar with communist Russia. And in an article by J.W. Richards entitled History's Bloody Mess, Why Marxism and Socialism Always Fails, he chronicles the thinking of Karl Marx and George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel and Friedrich Engels, his good friend. And they're working out, Engels and Marx are working out their logic. They're trying to describe history. They're looking at it over all the years, the series of struggles between the oppressors and the oppressed. Each struggle punctuated by an upheaval in which one system gives rise to another. The original state of man, they claimed, was a primitive communism without private property, and they want to restore that. The mass slavery of Egypt and all other ancient cultures represented the fall from which the primeval state, this primeval state of innocence, which gave rise to the slave system, which eventually gave way to feudalism, with poor serfs caring for large tracts of land owned by the nobles. Then feudalism gave way to capitalism, and that's how most of your Marxists and socialists don't like the idea of capitalism, though they use capitalism to increase their wealth on a daily basis. One of the problems he helps to define was Marxist, the Karl Marxist mentality on the value of a product. I mean, he thought that a product should cost whatever it costs to produce something, and that's what would determine a product's worth. But there's so much more that goes into determining what a product is worth. You know, the supply and demand, for instance, or the economic value being determined by how much someone is willing to pay for it, or how many laborers it took to build it, or what their skill level was, and how long it took to build or produce it. Labor adding value to the product. And so one of his blunders was the labor theory of value. But when his ideas had made it over to Russia in 1917, Vladimir Lenin, you've heard of him, and other intellectuals, believe it or not, in an agrarian culture that had little history and education in democracy and industrial capitalism, fell prey to these politicians. Harvard historian Richard Pipes has put it that communism or Marxism did not come to Russia as a result of popular uprising. It was imposed on her from above by a small minority hiding behind democratic slogans. Of course, Lenin's despotism was then followed by Joseph Stalin, the guy on the right, whose Communist Party led the Soviet Union from the mid-1920s until 1953, whose policies destroyed the livelihoods of industrial workers and created a forced famine in 1932 and in 1933 that killed millions of peasants. It was one of the largest scale massacres on the face of the earth to date. At some point, at its peak, there were at least 1,000 political executions per day under their regime, not including the countless millions that were sent to labor camps. And so Mr. Richards points out that whatever Marx expected, revolutions never sprang up in advanced industrial societies where there was a strong rule of law, but in poor agrarian cultures with career tracks for despots. I want you to stop and think about what he said. He said this type of policy, this type of public policy could only come to rise where the people were economically low and where education in this type of rule and government was non-existent. So poor and uneducated. Let me ask you a question. Did not Hosea say, "My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge"? Now that was true of the Jews. We can take that principle and apply it to our culture today. Is it not true, church, that the Christians are not to be ignorant of Satan's devices? This is a device of Satan. Anytime there is a greedy, power-hungry man, or woman for that matter, who wants to rise to political power so that they can have, somebody's got to be at the top of the political ladder. Somebody's going to be in charge. And somebody's going to have to be on, low men on totem pole. And so these types of people, like the guys that you see up here, they want to preach communism. They want to preach a shared wealth. They want to preach that nobody actually has any private property and that there is no class system at all. They want to get the lower class and the working class and the people that have not to be against the people that have. And if you can keep a war going between all that, then you can get more for yourself. People like a good culture. People that want to be in power love a good culture war. That's the way it's always been. And where do Christians fall into that? Well, since none of these folks like Christianity, that makes us a target. And that makes us have to do two things. Number one, we need to educate our culture and educate our society as to what God's Word says so that we can be saved from the wrath to come. One day this will all come to an end. Number two, you'll need to count the cost. Now, we've lived and we've ridden on the coattails of godly people who've established this country a long time ago. And we've enjoyed a good life in North America. But that may not always be. And the writing seems to be on the wall. You pass transgendered bathroom bills. What's up with that? We had that in the Obama administration. Now we got it back in Joe Biden's administration. We're signing bills for that, and you're going to threaten the schools that don't want to do that, that don't want to let guys posing as girls go into women's bathrooms. You're going to threaten them by taking what? Taking their federal funding away. The almighty dollar that rules the day. How about that? Isn't that interesting? And that's what we're up against today. Don't we have this today? Yes, we've got the problems today. Yeah, we've got a Marxist organization, Black Lives Matter, which is not really about black lives at all. Oh, it's got something about it, but I've had more people, black people, tell me, let's preach and let's help this culture get over the deadbeat fathers that don't want to, they want to be baby daddies, but they're absentee fathers. They don't want to help raise their kids. They're tired of having to, the women are trying to raise their families. They're tired of having to have two jobs, and they don't want to have to let the government raise their kids. Well, that's all on the BLM website. And yet on the very website, they say they've got to get rid of traditional family values. The nuclear family is the problem. No, the nuclear family is not the problem. Our culture is the problem. Sin is the problem. Not living together outside of marriage, that's the problem. Sex before marriage, that's the problem. We got all these other problems. We don't want to call it what it really is. So we've got Marxism that's alive and well, and it's got its tentacles into the different groups and the different quote-unquote classes of American culture, and they're using the same battle tactics that Marx insisted on in our own culture today. Let's have a good feud over class. Let's get people against each other and let's pit them one against the other. That's the ideology. By the way, in the book, there was a group of scholars in the 1990s that printed a book in 1997 called Black Book of Communism. And they estimate conservatively that between 85 million and 100 million human beings lost their lives to communist experiments in the 21st century, or in the 20th century. Not just talking about Russia, but China, the USSR, North Korea, Cambodia, Africa, Afghanistan, Vietnam, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and that's just to name a few. What about Madalyn Murray O'Hair? Wait, I think I'm forgetting somebody. You know what? I am forgetting somebody. I'm forgetting Hitler and the Holocaust. Hitler and the Holocaust. You said, well, Hitler, was he really a Marxist? Well, you know what? He really sort of was. I mean, you think about what Nazi even represents, what it means. It's the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. I want you to think about Hitler's upbringing. I want you to think about what was the motive that fired the lunacy of that leader. And there is a direct connection between the Holocaust and the teachings of Charles Darwin and his dogma of biological evolution. In 1859, Charles Darwin wrote Origin of the Species, and in that book, the author contended that higher levels of biological existence had attained as the strong eliminate the weak in the struggle for survival. So survival of the fittest. Darwin's influence was tremendous, and his ideas were applied to many areas of life. One of his admirers was Friedrich Nietzsche, a German philosopher. And Nietzsche took the famous naturalist reasoning to a higher level. He said, let's develop a super race. And he felt that such could only be achieved by the extinction of inferior races and individuals. Nietzsche was a vigorous opponent of Christian morality, surprise, which he knew fostered support for the weak, giving to the poor and that kind of thing. He thought that religious obstacles needed to be removed, and he demanded that the moral supremacy of Christianity and Judaism be overthrown. He also argued against the preservation of the sick and the suffering. He thought they ought to knock them off. And he was a major contributor to Hitler's thinking. Johann Fichte argued that Germans were the superior race destined to supreme leadership of the civilized world. And that's where Adolf Hitler get his ideas. He was born in 1889. He had an unhappy childhood. He was undisciplined. He was rebellious. He fought in World War I, was twice decorated. And in 1920, he joined the German Workers' Party, which eventually evolved into the Nazi Party. He was a skillful manipulator. He attempted to incite his own revolution. But he agreed that the Germans were the highest species on earth. He felt that if the Jews were allowed to mingle with the superior species, it would render futile an evolutionary higher stage of being. So he practiced eugenics, which was a system of elimination of biologically unfit individuals from society. What's he doing? He's waging war on culture. He's seeing class warfare. He's rising to power. You got to get rid of God. Where did Hitler get all these ideas? Well, he got his ideas from Fichte and Hegel, who inspired Marx and Lenin, Ernst Haeckel, Sir Arthur Keith. He got his ideas from all kinds of ungodly German philosophers. And then there's Madalyn Murray O'Hair. More recently, of course, she was prominent in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But here was America's poster girl for atheism for a lot of years. She was married and divorced, lived in an adulterous relationship with Murray, later married Richard O'Hair. She had all of her children out of wedlock, and disfellowshipped, if you could call it that, disowned one of her sons because he didn't want to go along with her madness. She's the woman who got rid of prayer in school. That's the woman who did that. She was an ugly, irritated woman. And I'm not talking about physically. I'm talking about she had a very mean spirit, and she eventually died at the hand of one of her workers. She was killed by an employee of hers. But she had a Marxist ideology. Her unemployment, her instability led her to her Marxism, which led her to atheism. And that's the point that I want to bring out in all of this, is that you've got people who are trying to take over the world and change the world and make the world this better place without God. And you can't make the world a better place without God. Romans 1 and verse number 28 says, since they thought it foolish to acknowledge God, He abandoned them to their own foolish thinking and led them to do things that they should never do. Jesus said, you'll always have the poor with you. And as you have opportunity, you can do them good. Galatians 2:10 says that we should remember the poor. So friends, this Marxism isn't really about helping the poor. It's not about it taking some of your hard-earned money and paying taxes to a government that budgets some of it for people in our land that are less fortunate than we are, having some government programs, even though that's exactly what it is. It's taking your money and using it and spending it on something else, someplace else. But Marxism is really about total control of government. And they package it up so sweet. And people that lack this idea of communism think, oh, well, we need clean-burning cars, and we'll eat clean food, and we'll all live in maybe smaller places. Maybe we don't need as much. And that's fine if everybody thinks they don't need as much, but then make that rule apply for everybody. And farmlands, they're not going to be owned by a few. That'll just be owned by the government, and they'll just have people that oversee those things. Friends, what is the end game for people like Karl Marx and the Lenins and all those folks? Well, it was really about them being in control. And that's the point. You know, the Bible tells us that there are people, there are false teachers who promise liberty, but that they themselves are slaves of corruption, for by whom a person is overcome, by him also a person is brought into bondage. 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 19. And I'm here to tell you that the largest organized atheistic movement in the world that has ever come into the ideas or minds of man has been Marxism. And friends, it is right at our doorstep, and probably has been for a long time. But have we been aware of it? And are we thinking about evangelism as a possible cure? I'm not saying that we need to use evangelism to politically throw our clout around. I don't think politics has anything to do with it. But I don't think we need to be ignorant of politics either. Lesson is yours. I've said enough maybe just to whet your appetite, and hopefully that you'll study a little bit more about this. Jesus introduced the gospel to a world that didn't accept it by and large. And the government was always against Christ and His apostles. We should not expect anything different either. If you're here today, you have never obeyed the gospel of Christ, you think, I really don't know if I'm saved. I want to be, but I don't know for sure. I have some doubts. Then I say, let's study the Bible and we can remove all doubt. If you're here today and you simply need the prayers of the church, we want to receive you down front. While together we stand and while we sing.
Kneel.